If I'm on. There I go. Hey, welcome. We're so glad that you are here this morning, both in person, and we're so glad that those of you at home have invited us into your home. It's just such a great time to be in the presence of God. So thank you so much for being here this morning.
Uh,
I didn't introduce
she
myself.
didn't introduce us, so I will. This is my wife, Jeannie Moore, and my name's Jason Moore. And um, we were reminded this week about how important community is. My father had open heart surgery 2 weeks ago, and his doctor actually sent us a video holding his heart. And it's just amazing. One, it's gross, but it's also amazing that you could actually see that. And then in 2 weeks, he's up moving around and doing things. And one of the things that reminded Jeannie and I of something we already knew, but it was a good thing to keep in our mind, is that doing things that are very simple can sometimes be the most powerful things you can do. And we often, I think, at least in our world, we kind of wait around for something spectacular to do instead of doing something that's just simple. And Jeannie and I were able to take really like a week's worth of meals to my dad and my stepmom, and how much that helped them and the things that that was able to provide for them was really a great reminder for us that there's powerful things that happen in the mundane things of life, and that breaking bread together is a powerful way of reminding us who God is and what God can do in our lives. And so we just wanted to think that maybe this week you can look out and see a need that somebody might have and try to fill that need as we think about building community and becoming more together as we move forward through the week.
So, as an act of togetherness, I'm going to ask you to stand, and we are going to read together Psalms 99. So, if you'll just follow along with us. The Lord reigns. Let the Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at the screen. Is it on? The Lord reigns. Let the people tremble. He sits enthroned upon the cherubim. Let the earth quake. The Lord is great in Zion. He is exalted over all the peoples. Let them praise your great and awesome name. Holy is he. The King is his might, loves justice. You have established equality. You have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. Exalt the Lord our God. Worship at his footstool. Holy is he. And if you just take a seat, we're going to meditate on what's on the screen here coming up.
Good morning. Oh, that was good. Almost like you're awake. I'm glad you're here. Thanks for being here. If you're online, thanks for being with us. As the Moors said a while ago, thanks for allowing us into your space, into that room, into your very special house. And we're glad to be able to be with everybody this morning. So let me try to move quickly this morning. Last week, we started a series from the book of Ruth. I said this is a really short book. It's only 4 chapters. It's a unique book, though. And so what we're going to do is we're actually, over the next couple of weeks, we're going to read the whole thing together. Maybe this will be the first time we've ever done this around here, where we cover every verse. We're going to read it all the way through. As we do that, here's something you're going to notice. The book doesn't talk a lot about God specifically. In fact, the narrator never mentions God. But what we're going to discover is this underlying theme of how God is present no matter whether we mention him or not. So let's just review a couple of things from last week if you weren't with us. The book starts out with this phrase, in the days when judges ruled. Now, that is a very specific phrase, and what they were saying and what it should have implied to the hearers is that when the judges were ruling in God's kingdom, in other words, in God's plan as he was establishing his nation, they didn't have kings at the time, and they had kind of moved away from this Levitical system to the sense that there were these judges that were playing a part in everything. And these judges, the problem is many of them, most of them, were not people, men of noble character. So what was creeping into the land, what Israel was doing, is they were moving further and further away from the ways of God, along with the judges, and it was creating a mess. There was a family at that time, the man's name was Elimelech, and he lived in Bethlehem. And while he was living there, in the time of the judges, there was a famine. And the famine was creating tension, as you can imagine. Anybody missing something in their life right now because of all the supply chain issues? Well, that's just shipment, right? Now we're dealing with famine, and that's what was going on in the land. I'll show you what happened. So he took his family, and he went from Bethlehem to the land of Moab. Now, you should notice when you see this map that when he moved his family over, look, if there was a famine here in Bethlehem, there was going to be a famine just on the other side of the Dead Sea as well. So, and the interesting thing is God had warned the Israelites about the Moabites. He said, don't include them in the assembly. And what he was saying was don't include them in the political structure, the everyday rule of your cities. He said, these people didn't treat you well when you came out of, and of course they knew that, they told stories, but they didn't treat you well when you were coming out of Egypt. And so God had kind of issued some harsh statements against these people, and probably, what we can only assume, the text doesn't say, is Elimelech must have had some family or knew somebody over in this area. So he thought, well, I've got to get them somewhere safe. We got to make a decision. We don't have any food, so he goes to Moab. Now, it sounds really dire to say, well, God kind of had restrictions on the Moabites, and God had kind of pushed them to the side, or if you will, and that might be the way you hear it. But the reality is this: something bigger was going on with the nation of Israel. If you go back to Genesis 12, it says the Lord is talking to Abram, and he says, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. And then watch this. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. And Moab, the people of Moab, fell into that. So there's this tension there, but he takes his family, Elimelech does, and he goes to this place. But God's wanting to use the Israelites to bless the whole world. The problem is, it's the time of the judges, and everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes. And because of that, we get this tension in Ruth chapter 1. Along with that, not only do we get the tension of all of that going on in the life of the Israelites, we get the tension that Elimelech takes his family because of this famine, and he moves them to this space, and we don't know, at least a span of 10 years, he dies. And then his 2 sons die. And in a culture like theirs, the wife was then left on her own. This was a very patriarchal society. So Naomi is left with only 2 daughters-in-laws, and the 2 daughters-in-laws were actually Moabite women. So she tries to push them away. She says, go back to your people, your family. This tragic thing has happened to me. In fact, she's going to start talking about changing her name to Mara, to bitter, because she realizes it's like the hand of God is just out against her. But in the middle of all of that, one of these young Moabite women, the widow, she steps in and she starts to say something that if you're an Israelite, this would be shocking to you. She says, Ruth says to Naomi, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. She makes this really definitive declaration. Watch this. She says, where you die, I'm going to die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. In the middle of this tragedy, chapter 1, Naomi is feeling like she's lost again. She has nobody to protect her, and she really doesn't. And she's thinking, I'm just going to have to go back to Bethlehem and see what's going on there. And Ruth steps in the middle of her pain, in the middle of her fear, in the middle of everything that's going on. Ruth comes in with this loyal statement. In fact, she models something that would have been shocking to the Israelites. This would not have been expected at all. The Moabites didn't follow God like they did. The Moabites didn't have this kind of structure. They didn't know the laws of God. And yet here is this Moabite woman who is saying, you know what? Above everything else, I'm throwing my hat in with you. Your God is my God now. And I want to serve you. And she expresses this loyal love. So we ended last week with a couple of questions. I asked you to think in the chaos, the season, maybe that I hope we're coming out of, but I don't know that it's going to end as of yet. If you're thinking, you're feeling like there's so much pressure in your life, and maybe you feel depressed about things and things aren't working out well, I asked you, is there a Ruth anywhere in your life? Has God provided somebody that expresses a loyal love to you, that maybe that's his way of reaching out to you? Or is it possible that you're Ruth in somebody else's life? Are you that loyal love, that expression of the character of God in somebody else's life? And I asked you to think about that this week. That in the middle of the stuff that's going on, in the middle of everything, the chaos, the uncertainty, is it possible that God's got somebody in your life where he's trying to say to you, I love you, please still pay attention? Or maybe you're saying to somebody else, God loves you, please still pay attention. We're going to pick it up with the last verse of Ruth chapter 1 this week. It's kind of a summary verse as it gets us into the next section. It says this in verse 22, so Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now this is kind of the verse that's going to lead us into the new next section. And a couple things. One, we've got the two main characters now, Naomi and Ruth, and they're coming back to Bethlehem, and they're doing it at a very specific time, at the time of the harvest. Remember, they left because of famine. They left Bethlehem, the house of bread is what that name means. They left that space empty with no food, right? And now they're returning back, and there's the barley in the harvest season is in play, and now everything, all the food is starting to come back in. And when they left, and then they got back to Bethlehem, chapter 1, verse 19 says, there was this stir among the people. Last week I said it's like a buzz. I thought about it again this week. My grandmother might have said something like, everybody was talking about it on the party line. You know what a party line is? Go Google it later. You'll figure it out. It's when the phones used to be connected to the wall still. There's a sense that everybody was talking about not just Naomi coming back, this long-lost relative, but Ruth. There's this Moabite woman that's come back with her, and it's shocking. Like everybody is talking about it. That's what the text implies, that everybody's going, hey, did you hear about this? Did you hear about this Moabite woman? Did you hear how she's responded? Did you hear the things she did? Did you hear the things she said to Naomi? Did you hear how she committed to her? It was completely unexpected from the Israelite perspective that a Moabite person would have offered this kind of loyal love. Let's pick it up in verse 1, chapter 2. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Now, I always have to stop you because especially at the beginning of kind of the next scene, there's going to be some things embedded in here that are real important for us to pay attention to. It's not a shock that Naomi had relatives in Bethlehem. That's where she was from. Shouldn't be a shock for any of us to think she went back to her homeland and there were people there that would know her. It was interesting, though, that this man that was part of her husband's clan is labeled this way with the description of worthy. What time period are we in? Chapter 1. A time period when the judges were at play, when they were leading. When sin was everywhere. Remember one author last week said it was like sin just oozed everywhere. Everything was touched by sin to the point that everybody seemed to be corrupt in the day. Terrible leadership. Nothing good is happening kind of a thing. We've forgotten the ways of God. And yet in the middle of that, here's a guy, Boaz, and he's worthy. He's worthy. The word is noble in character. And again, think about it. It's already been described as the days when the judges ruled. So for the Israelite listening to this message being read, they would have heard the word worthy, and it would have sparked something in them. Because in the book of Judges, there was a judge who was described as worthy when he first came on the scene. Judges 6, verse 12, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him, Gideon, and he said to him, the Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor. And that word, O mighty man of valor, is the same word for worthy in Ruth. Now, it's a different description. It's a little bit of a different bend. Gideon was noble in character and especially on the battlefield. He had great conquests on the battlefield, so that word picks up the battle piece of it. Boaz had none of that. He'd never been to battle like this. He had not earned any valor on the battlefield, but he was this man of character. And as they heard that, probably they would have said to each other, I wonder if Boaz is going to turn out like Gideon, because see, Gideon washed out. His character didn't last. He was brave on the battlefield, but his character with God waned in his life. Would Boaz play the same role? It's a weird season, right? Think about it today. Think about the season we're in. It seems like everything is shifting. I heard last week of another failure of a pastor on a very public stage. A pastor who got caught on Friday and arrested for soliciting a minor, and by Sunday was on stage at church. And the church didn't know. And the news broke Monday morning. The failures are all around us. I mean, it just kind of feels like we're in this days when the judges are ruling again. Like it just seems like character is failing. And in the middle of this story, we get a Boaz who's worthy, a man of noble character, but we're kind of holding our breath. Is it going to last? Is it going to fail like everything else? I was at a conference this week. I probably will mention it a couple of times because I can tell you that these conversations with the leaders of the faith across the country right now are starting to get very focused on what's going on. There's so much failure around us. And one of my favorite author speakers in the modern period right now is a guy named Skye Jethani. And he made this statement. He said, listen, I can tell you the 501c3 church is in trouble, but the church of God is not in trouble. Boaz is a man worthy. What does that mean? As we get into this third character that's being introduced to the story, the Israelites would have been sitting on the edge of their seats listening to this going, what's Boaz going to bring to the story? Let's keep going, verse 2. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. Now this is interesting because Ruth, who is a Moabite, who did not grow up under the Mosaic law, is now asking to participate in what she knows to be, should exist, the Mosaic law that actually protects the widows and the orphans and the immigrants in that area. In other words, if Israel is truly still living with any inkling towards the Word of God, They should be living a certain way, and that way is this, that when it's time for the barley harvest and it's time to pull the grain and the wheat and everything in out of the fields, the farmers under the Mosaic law were going to leave the corners. They were not going to harvest everything. In fact, as they gathered and kind of wrapped up the sheaves, they put the bundles of grain and wheat and stuff together, they would drop some, and the law said, if you drop it, just leave it. Leave it for the person who economically is in trouble right now. Leave it for the person who's hungry. Don't pick it all up. Trust God. He brought the harvest. Now leave part of the harvest for the people who are the most destitute, the most at risk in your culture. Let it be there. And here's Ruth saying to Naomi, I'm going to go do this thing. Like this is how you still live together, right? You Israelites, this was the law of God. How does she know that? The text doesn't tell us. But notice, Naomi didn't tell Ruth, go out, here's what's going to happen. They're going to leave the corners for you. No, the Moabite woman says to the Israelite, I'm going to go out. I'm going to get us some food. Hopefully in a place where I'm going to find some favor with the guy whose field I'm in. Are you getting the sense of how unusual this is? Are you getting the sense that God's doing something behind the scenes? Are you getting the sense that even God's people are a little lost, and here's this foreigner, this immigrant, this now widow who actually is understanding what God should look like when people follow him? This is unusual. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. Genesis says what? God spoke, he created everything. Eventually we get to the part of God creating mankind, and what do we read? He created us in his image. It should not be unusual that we're leaving the edges of the field for people in need. God says, this is how I want you to live in community. This is how I want you to show people that you trust me. That it's not just all about you, that you're paying attention to the other people in your community. That I created you in my image, and when I did that, I made you to be in my image. I gave you this ability to have this worth that you can't have apart from me. It's words like that inspired, I'm going to say it. It inspired things like our Constitution saying all men are created equal. It did. I'm not defending anything. I'm just telling you these are the words. This should not be unusual because the scriptures have unfolded this idea that everybody is created in the image of God and has value and worth and should be cared for. And we should watch out for them. It's that image that shouldn't surprise us when it created systems for caring for others in our very cultures and our cities. It shouldn't be surprising that it's inspired generations of Christians starting schools and hospitals all throughout history, right? Why? Because we're all created in the image of God. We all have a value, a worth, no matter what your political beliefs are, what your religious beliefs are. We have a value and a worth that God gave us. It shouldn't surprise us that this is the very foundation where a guy named William Wilberforce stood up and said, we need to abolish slavery. But it's surprising here. It's a little shocking because why? Because the people of God had forgotten his ways. They weren't paying attention. And here's a Moabite woman, a foreigner, a widow, somebody who's really destitute, who needs some help. And she's reminding us about the character of God in this story. She's reminding us of why we should have goodwill towards people in our culture. She was qualified to glean, but at the same time she said, I really need to go to a field where I can have favor, because if I don't have favor, can you just imagine who's going to take advantage of her? I made a note to myself. There's this paradox. We want life to be all about right and wrong all the time, but there's this tough paradox, right? Some people are going to honor God and let Ruth glean from their fields, but some people, right, are only going to use God to honor themselves, and they're going to take advantage of Ruth. And so she's praying and telling Naomi, she's saying to Naomi, hey, just maybe I can find favor out there I can glean and I can be safe as I do this. But she's worried about finding favor because there's this paradox, right? There's this struggle in our culture today. There's this struggle we feel about how we walk our faith out. I was telling somebody earlier, I just heard this week, these are new numbers, that in 2020 we lost 30% of the pastors in this country. Like we were just not even sure what happened, like everything else. We lost 30%. Why? There's this paradox. We're trying to figure it out. Like a famine is hit and we're all trying to figure it out. And even the pastors are forgetting some of what they maybe should be remembering about who God is. And you're seeing it at the highest levels of leadership at the church. We see it around here. If you're here this morning, if you're not in the room with us, we can tell you the numbers because we've been dealing with them for the last couple of months extensively. That after 18 months, we've lost 60% of the people that used to call Journey home. We've lost 60% or more of our budget numbers, of our giving. There's this paradox going on. Ruth knows that under Mosaic law, she should be able to go and glean and she should be safe. But she says to Naomi, pray that I can find favor because if I don't, I could be in trouble myself. Why? Because sometimes, as much as we don't want to admit it, there is still a group that's going to honor God, but there are people who are using God for their own honor, and that creates tension for us. And sometimes when days get tough, that's what happens, right? In the days of the judges, when sin oozed everywhere and the nations started doing what was right in their own eyes, here's the thing. There's still some who did not forget God. There's still some who did not forget what it meant to follow God. Verse 3, let's keep going. We'll never finish. We're only in verse 3. We're going to go through all of chapter 2. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. I'm sorry, I gotta stop again because I love this. She happened to come to the field. Happened to come in Hebrew. Here's the phrase. I had to write it down because I couldn't remember it. She chanced upon the field. She chanced upon the field. She happened to come. Today we would say, oh, it was a stroke of luck. The narrator wants the Israelite people to understand she didn't know who Boaz was. She didn't know that was his field. She chanced upon it. Pay attention to that. That's going to come to play. Verse 4, we'll keep going. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, the house of bread, and said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless you. This is just a statement. He's from this area, okay? We know they're in Bethlehem. They're just saying he's in this area. Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? That sounds really nice. Okay, I'm just telling you, Boaz noticed her. Okay, so can we just all admit that he probably said, oh, who's that? Yeah, inflection. You hear my inflection? You're all acting like you're nervous. You don't want to go there. She might have been a looker. He's paying attention all of a sudden. Hey, who is it? Who's that? Never seen her. Do you do that when you're so destitute, down and out? Maybe you've been homeless for a season. And I mean, he would have expected her to look a certain way. Boaz pays attention. He goes, hey, who's that young woman? The servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, she's the young Moabite woman. Verse 19, chapter 1, verse 19. There was a big stir. They were talking about her. She's that Moabite woman. She's that young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for just a short rest. Then Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter, do not glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep close to my other young people who are pulling in, gathering from those corners. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? she asked for favor. Boaz says, I'm going to ask these young men, they better not touch you. They better not hurt you. They better not assault you. She's an immigrant. She's a widow. She's a person who's at risk. He says, I want her protected. And when you're thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, Now listen, he's a man of what? He's a man worthy. He's of noble character. And he's laid all this out for her. And she says, why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me since I am a foreigner? And I love this answer. Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me. How you left your father and mother, your native land, came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. He says, you're noble. She's recognized he's noble. The text has already recognized, the narrator's already said he's a worthy man. But now Boaz is saying to her, she's worthy. She's noble too. And then he said, I found favor. And then she said, I found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoke kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers and he passed her to her the roasted grain. And she ate until she was, what's this word? She ate till she was, there you go, satisfied. Till she was full. She didn't eat till she was so gorged that she couldn't even get up from the table. She ate till she was satisfied. And watch. And after that, she had some left over. Watch what she does. But when she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out from some of the bundles. Intentionally drop some. Glean. When they're going and they're cutting the stalks and wrapping them. So somebody just asked, if you're online, somebody asked about gleaning. That's a good word. Actually, not a farming community anymore around here. We used to be. And they're wrapping these sheaves together, the bundling them, that they're cutting them. So as they're doing that, he says, don't let some drop. Let some drop. In the Mosaic law, if you let it drop, you were supposed to leave it there. He's saying intentionally. Can you imagine a farmer saying, go ahead and let some of the crops fall. We're going to leave it for some people who need it. We're going to let them have it. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had. She had to take and separate the grain from the stalks, and she beat it out. And it was about an ephah of barley that was left. I've been told that's roughly about a month's worth of food. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law, Naomi, saw what she had gleaned. And she also brought out and gave her what food she had left over from being satisfied. She ate till she was satisfied. She had some left. She took it to her mother-in-law. She's noble. She's noble. Verse 19, and her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Like she's probably shocked at the amount of work she got done. Blessed be the man who took notice of you. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she worked and said, the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. I worked with Boaz in his field. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Why did she say that? Because her husband's dead. Her husband's dead, and she knows that Ruth has gained some favor probably because of her connection there. So blessed be him because he didn't turn his back on his family. Naomi also said to her, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. One of our redeemers. Now here's the interesting thing. No Israelite is going to ever believe in chance. So the idea of the chance chanced upon her, that was for their benefit. That was for their benefit. There was no plan set aside. There was no plan that came up with behind the scenes for Ruth to go to this field. It simply was the providence of God beginning to work out in the story. And here's the thing. When it says no Israelite would ever believe in a thing called chance, that played out in both the good and the bad settings. Think about that for a second. There are some things that it's fun, right? You know, the holiday shopping season's coming up, and as Americans, what do? We consumer side kicks in, and we go shopping. It's not bad to buy presents, okay? It's not bad to buy presents. And we get to the mall or wherever we go to shop, and we pull in, and there's that one parking spot right up front, and you just think, oh my gosh, that's great, right? So good. God's favor's all over me today. The Israelites would have thought a little more deeply about this. That it wasn't by chance that she found that field. It just happened to be connected to Boaz, who was their redeemer. But at the same time, it's also not by chance that all the other stuff comes into your life too. Now please, there's a fine line here between bad things that happen and then abusive things that can be abusive towards people in our culture. And I don't ever I think some of these verses get misused, and I don't ever want to imply that abuse is by the hand of God. But the Israelites would have been paying attention to this story, and Naomi's had this tragedy hit her. But now she's got this expression of loyal love through this person named Ruth. And so the same hand of God that allowed the famine to try to alter the people, to have them pay attention to where they were being disobedient, is the same hand of God that brings Naomi back at the very point of when the barley season is going to start. And it's the same hand of God who guides Ruth to a field who's owned by one of her relatives. The providence of God is on display. If you're taking notes, if you want to write anything down, in chapter 2, the providence of God begins to really be put on display. The providence of God is starting to come out, and we don't even have to name it. Like the wording alone would have caused the Israelites to know that God's hand was on this whole story. The best of the times and the worst of the times, the providence of God is working. I thought this week to myself, I said, I wonder if Paul wasn't thinking about this story when in Romans 8 he made this statement. He says, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. I think maybe the story of Ruth might have been in there a little bit. The story of Ruth might have been in there as he's thinking about how God's, listen, not saying that God ordains all this abuse and all the crazy stuff that can happen in our world, but that the hand of God is present all the time. And for those who love him, who pursue him, whom he pursues, there is this ability for things to work out according to his purpose. And we're going to see it by the end of chapter 4. Stay with me. In 2 weeks, it culminates. It's so cool that by the end of chapter 4, this whole story is going to culminate for the purposes of God in a way that Naomi could have never seen coming. But for now, what's happening? The providence of God is being put on display. The providence of God is being put on display. And Naomi says, this man's a relative of ours, one of our redeemers. If you don't know that word, this would have really caused everybody to sit up and take notice. Because a redeemer is somebody who's going to pay a price. They're going to rescue somebody. They're going to have the ability to buy back something, to bring it back to safety. The word that gets used in the scriptures a lot of times is kinsman redeemer, and it comes from this passage in Leviticus 25. If your brother becomes poor and sells part of his property, then his nearest redeemer, his nearest oldest male relative with the ability to take some resources and go get it and bring it back, to buy it back, shall come and redeem what his brother has sold. If a man has no one to redeem it and then himself becomes prosperous and finds sufficient means to redeem it, let him calculate the years he sold it and pay back the balance to the man to whom he sold it, and then return to his property. The whole idea of a kinsman redeemer is this person, this oldest male relative in their culture, that's who would have been the redeemer, is to have who has the capacity to go and get it back and return it where it was supposed to be. For an Israelite who might be for some reason outside of the family, outside of the culture in that moment and can't get back in, the kinsman redeemer is the one who can safely return them into the family. Naomi says he's our redeemer. He's the guy that can help us get a life back, to be protected, to be able to have nourishment, to be able to have the kind of things we need just to live on a daily basis. He's our redeemer. And the providence of God is being put on display. We'll close it out. And Ruth the Moabite said, besides. I love it. Ruth is thinking, well, okay, I guess all that's true, but here's what I know. Remember, a man worthy, noble character. Besides, he said to me, you shall keep close to my young men until they have finished all the harvest. Well, I don't know about all of that, but you know what? He's watching out over me and over you. He is doing that. I don't know if he's our kinsman redeemer. I was only married into the family, right? It was my husband, your son, but I know this, he's acting like it. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted. She goes, stay here, because I know the risk. I know the risk. You're still young. You're a widow. You're an immigrant. You can be overlooked. You can be overlooked. Somebody might abuse you. So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Are you able to see the providence of God in your life? Is that something that you even think about? If you're like me, I feel a little bit like Elimelech. Like when things start to go wrong, I just immediately start thinking, okay, I got to move my family. I got to get them to where they're going to be safe. I got to do the right things. I got to make sure that I'm on top of my game, because when I'm on top of my game, then everybody gets provided around me. And yet, here's the problem. Elimelech's plan fails. It fails miserably. We're not told if he was right or wrong. We're just told he had a plan, he acted, and it failed. And in the middle of that failure, the comforting thing that the Israelites should have been paying attention to is now we start to see the providence of God, the hand of God work its way out. It probably didn't feel like it, right? It probably didn't always feel like it. It probably didn't always make sense. Naomi's circumstances weren't necessarily improving drastically. This took a lot of time to happen. But the providence, the hand of God is at work. And so I just tended to wonder this past week as I was finalizing some thoughts here. I thought, I wonder if the questions we ask sometimes aren't the wrong questions. Like we keep asking, when's all this chaos going to end? When's life going to return to normal? When's everything going to go back to the way it was? And I'm not sure that that's the right question. I tend to wonder, in light of the providence of God being put on display in such a tragic story, if maybe the question isn't, where are you with God in the middle of the chaos? Where is God with you in the middle of the chaos? There's some very concrete truths we're told from the scriptures. Jesus laid some things out for his disciples. In Matthew 28, he said, look, I'm always going to be with you. I'm always going to be with you. He doesn't define exactly how that's going to play out. He doesn't tell them every circumstance they're going to go through. He doesn't tell them what's going to be good, what's going to be bad, what's going to be positive, what's going to be negative. He just simply says, I'm always going to be with you. Here's the truth. So even when you can't feel it, I'm always going to be with you. Even when the circumstances don't look so good, I'm always going to be with you. And by the end of Ruth, you're going to see it. It's going to be so clear. But right now, here's where we are. Ruth has experienced this tragic scene, and now she's come back around, and the providence of God is starting to be revealed. And I just wonder if somewhere in there, she doesn't finally start to sit back and wonder to herself, where is God with me? Am I with God in the middle of all of this? Can I trust God in those moments when I feel like I can't even see him? And what does it look like to trust God in those moments? I want you to pray with me. I want you to sit there for just a second. If you're at home, I know because over the pandemic, sometimes I was at home as well. I know that the little screens in front of you, there's just too many distractions. So I'm going to ask you to push aside the distractions as much as possible. If you're sitting here in this room, maybe closing your eyes helps the best because you stop paying attention to the movement around you and the people next to you. And I'm just curious If God was to ask you this morning, hey, have you noticed my providence anywhere in your life today, this week, this year, what would you say? How about if I ask you the question, do you find yourself praying, wishing, hoping that the chaos would go away, that everything would just simply return to normal? But if it did return to normal, would you pay attention to the providence of God in the normal time? Were we paying attention to the providence of God when things were more normal? Father, your words bring us comfort, not because you tell us everything is going to work out perfectly as we would have it work out, but you just continually reveal that you are the kind of God who will not leave it alone. You are the kind of God who's chasing after us as people created in your image. You desire for us to be with you in relationship. And as you chase us, Father, we sometimes get so caught up in the world around us that we miss your hand. We miss seeing you. We miss those little moments where your providential rule over everything just kind of shows itself a little bit more. Father, this week, would you give us the grace, give us the courage to face, give us the ability to recognize your providence in our lives. And may we become the kind of people who walk with the power of knowing you're with us. Not walking out perfect lives. Listen, none of us have perfect lives. But when we see your providence, there's a power, there's an ability to walk with a confidence that's not shaken by all the circumstances of the world around us. That's what we're looking for, Father. That's what we want to experience. That's what we want to model. That's what we want to invite people to discover about you. May we be those kind of people this week, I pray in Christ's name. Amen. Listen, as we close out, if you're online, love you guys. We already cut out, I think, online. That's okay. Keep going, guys. They know back there. They shut down that online stuff.